The anti slavery movement. People who changed America. Introduction. America in 1860. The roots of slavery. In 1860, nearly 4 million black people were slaves in the United States. Slavery in America was far older than the United States itself. Africans were first brought as laborers to the English colony of Virginia in 1619. By the 1660s, most Africans in the colony had been made slaves. Some American colonists, especially in the South, needed many workers to grow crops such as tobacco, rice, and cotton. At first, most of these workers were indentured servants from Europe. In exchange for the cost of their trip to America, they worked for a master for a fixed number of years. Then they were freed. Indentured slaves worked hard. Many masters treated their slaves or servants cruelly. After 1680, fewer indentured servants came to America, so slave traders brought more Africans here. In 1680, blacks made up less than 7% of Virginia's population. By 1750, they were nearly 44%. Unlike indentured servants, enslaved Africans came to the Americas against their will. They were torn from everything they knew: family, home, and culture. They were bought and sold. Slave owners saw slaves not as human beings but as property. Children whose mothers were slaves became slaves too. Slaves could not leave their owner's land without a written pass. They were often punished. By 1808, it was against U.S. law to import more slaves. At that time, there were about 1 million slaves in the United States. Since no more slaves were being imported from other countries, the value of those already here increased greatly. The slave trade in the United States became a big business. But some Americans thought slavery was wrong. They struggled to abolish or end slavery. Because of this, they were called abolitionists. Life under slavery. Most slaves worked in the fields. They plowed, planted, and harvested crops. On smaller farms, slaves often worked beside their owners, but on larger farms called plantations, an overseer or slave driver supervised the slaves. If slaves made a mistake or didn't work quickly enough, the overseer might beat them. Owners could treat their slaves almost any way they wished. They could sell or trade their slaves any time. Slave families were often broken up. Mothers, fathers, and children might be sold to different owners. Slave owners decided what their slaves did and how many hours they worked. Most slaves worked all year in all kinds of weather. During harvest season, slaves would begin work before sunrise and continue into the night. Slave children usually started working when they were 8 years old. Some started sooner. They would do the easier chores. They pulled weeds, fetched water, and gathered wood. On cotton plantations, most house servants were children. The men and women were needed to work in the fields. A slave was considered an adult by age 12. Owners gave their slaves food, clothing, and housing, but they didn't pay them. Many slaves lived in windowless, one-room cabins with dirt floors. They were often hungry and cold in the winter. Many slaves raised food in small gardens they tended after their long workday had ended. In their own words, I am not only an American slave, but a man, and as such am bound to use my powers for the welfare and of the whole human brotherhood. Frederick Douglass. Chapter 1. Slavery, Right or Wrong? Frederick Douglass. In 1838, a young black man escaped from what he later called the Dark Night of Slavery in Maryland. In the North, he joined the anti-slavery movement and became a powerful speaker and writer. The young man worked hard to end slavery and fought for equality for all people. His name was Frederick Douglass. Douglass was born a slave around 1818. One of his owners started to teach 8-year-old Frederick to read, but this was against the law, so her husband made her stop. Southerners feared that teaching slaves to read would make them unfit to be slaves. Frederick understood that being able to read was a path